The ship has been at sea for 14 months. She left the Thames in the grey of an October morning, riding low with English broadcloth and tin, and now she is coming back. Her hull is dark with salt. Her sails are stained the colour of old parchment. Her crew of 42 men has been reduced to 31. The others were left behind at sea in ways that nobody's family will ever quite understand. And packed in her hold, cushioned in sawdust and oilcloth, carefully roped against the rolling, are casks of pepper from the Malabar coast, bales of indigo blue enough to stain your hands for a week, bolts of Chinese silk as thin as breath, and a small locked chest containing nutmeg worth more by weight than silver. She enters the Pool of London on an incoming tide, her pilot navigating by memory and instinct through a river so choked with other vessels that from the south bank it looks less like water and more like a floating city. Crewmen line the rail, watching the Thames grow dense around them. Some of them have not seen England in over a year. One of them, barely 17 years old, is seeing London for the first time in his life. He stares. He keeps staring. He cannot stop. Welcome to Mystique History. What was the Port of London truly like in the 17th century? The most consequential, chaotic, and astonishing stretch of river in the known world. Let me explain. To understand what the Port of London meant in the 1600s, you have to strip away every modern idea about what a port looks like.
Make way, coming through.
There were no cranes of steel. There were no concrete quays. There were no containers stacked in geometric towers. What there was, stretching from the shadow of London Bridge down to the bend at Blackwall in the east, was a living organism, dense, loud, dangerous, and breathing with a kind of purpose that nothing in the modern world quite replicates. Hundreds of ships moored in the river at any given time, not lined up at docks because there were no enclosed wet docks on the Thames in the early 17th century. They sat in the river itself, at anchor or on mooring chains, broadside to the current, their hulls bumping against each other in the chop, their masts making a bare, swaying forest against the London sky. The stretch of river known as the Pool of London, running roughly from London Bridge eastward to Limehouse, was the operational heart of all of it. In its upper and lower sections, ships from every maritime nation in Europe rode the tide together.
Heave! Watch the line!
A Flemish hulk loaded with Baltic timber. A French wine ship from Bordeaux, her deck still smelling of the Gironde estuary. A Dutch Fluit, the most efficient cargo vessel of the age, wide-bellied and shallow-drafted, built to carry maximum weight with minimum crew, sitting heavy in the water beside English merchant ships that had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and come back carrying the wealth of Asia. The pool was, at all times, a contest of national ambitions dressed up as commerce. Every flag in that river represented a country that wanted more of the world's trade than it currently had. Before any of those goods could touch English soil legally, they had to pass a gauntlet.
We must inspect your cargo.
Pilots licensed by Trinity House, the guild established under Henry VIII in 1513, responsible for navigation on the Thames, boarded incoming vessels at Gravesend, at the mouth of the river's estuary, and took the helm for the passage upriver. The largest ships, the East Indiaman especially, had to lighten their loads at the deep water anchorage at Long Reach near Gravesend before they could even attempt the shallower passage upstream.
Secure that line, lads.
Cargo was transferred from their holds to waiting lighters right there in the estuary, reducing the ship's draft so she could ride higher and clear the river's sandbars.
We require immediate access to the hold, sir. We must compare...
By the time she reached the pool, she had already been visited by customs officials who had come aboard at Gravesend to begin the process of cataloguing what she carried and what the Crown was owed.
Heave-ho, men. Watch the ropes there.
The tide waiter, who stayed aboard through the entire upriver journey, was there not as a passenger but as a watchdog, a representative of the Crown whose presence was supposed to prevent any creative rearrangement of the manifest between the estuary and London Bridge.
Look alive, he's coming this way.
Getting goods off those ships and onto dry land was not simple. The river between the moored vessels was alive with smaller craft, flat-bottomed lighters, wide enough to carry entire bales of cargo, rowed or poled by the men known as lightermen. These were not casual labourers. They were specialists, apprenticed for 7 years to their trade, licensed by the Company of Watermen founded back in 1514, and possessed of a knowledge of the Thames so intimate it bordered on the supernatural. They knew which tides to ride and which to fight. They knew which channels had enough depth for a laden barge on a neap tide and which would strand them in the mud. They steered their heavy, oarless craft, using nothing but long sweeps of timber and the force of the current itself, threading through the chaos of the pool without charts, without engines, without hesitation. When a lighterman called across the water, other men moved out of his way, not because of any formal authority, but because everyone who worked the river understood the hierarchy of competence.
Port or starboard?
Above the waterline, threading between the ships at a different pace, were the watermen. Where lightermen moved goods, watermen moved people. They operated small, nimble wherries, sharp-prowed, canopied boats built for speed, and their business was the city's commuter traffic. The Thames in the early 17th century was not merely a trade artery, it was the primary road of London. The streets of the city were too narrow, too congested, too unpaved and filthy for fast travel. If you needed to move quickly between the city and Westminster, if you were a lawyer going to court, a merchant going to the exchange, a royal official going to Whitehall, you went by river. Watermen stationed at every set of stairs leading down to the water competed fiercely for fares, calling out across the water in the specialised idiom of their trade, a kind of street-level theatre that Londoners found both raucous and indispensable. By the opening decade of the 1600s, something new had entered this already complex picture.
Master Governor, the Crown is pleased to grant...
On the last day of the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I had granted a royal charter to a group of London merchants who called themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. History remembers them simply as the East India Company. Their first fleet of 5 ships departed from Woolwich in April 1601, heading south into the Atlantic and then east around the Cape of Good Hope. When they returned, their holds contained pepper, cloves and nutmeg, the spices that European kitchens had been desperate for, and that Portuguese and Dutch merchants had been growing rich supplying for decades.
Surely fall. We must secure our share quickly.
The English were late to this particular table, and they knew it.
Here it appears weak. This is where we make port.
They were determined not to remain so. By 1614, the company had outgrown its initial shipyard at Deptford and moved its operations further downstream to Blackwall, where the depth of the river allowed larger vessels to be built and launched without grounding. The yard at Blackwall was fully operational by 1617, employing hundreds of workers, shipwrights, caulkers, rope makers, sail makers, blacksmiths, and the carpenters who shaped hool timbers with adzes in the open air. The smell of fresh-cut oak and hot tar drifted downriver. The sound of hammers on timber rang across the marshland. The ships that emerged from this yard were unlike anything England had routinely produced before. Great East Indiamen of 600 or 700 tons, their sterns gilded and carved, flying the company's striped flag, heavily armed against the Portuguese and Dutch warships they would encounter in the Indian Ocean. These were not merely merchant vessels. They were statements. England was declaring loudly that it intended to be present at every profitable corner of the globe. Understand what this meant for the dockside world around them. Every ship that returned from the east brought goods that London had never seen in abundance before. Pepper, which had been a luxury affordable mainly by the wealthy, began to appear on middle-class tables. Cotton cloth from Gujarat arrived in bales to be processed in the weavers' workshops of Spitalfields. Indigo from the subcontinent, a deep saturated blue that no European plant could match, transformed the dyeing trade. Silk from China and Persia arrived in quantities sufficient to supply the tailors of Cheapside. The warehouses of the city, many of them in cellars beneath the halls of livery companies, filled with goods that smelled of places most Londoners could not locate on a map and could barely imagine. The East India Company stored its most valuable cargoes, pepper, spices, indigo, in city vaults, not at the open dockside. The reasoning was straightforward and grim. The river was not safe. The Port of London in the 17th century operated under a system of such concentrated opportunity for theft that it had generated its own entire criminal economy. Ships arriving from foreign ports were legally required to unload their dutiable goods only at one of the designated Legal Quays, a narrow stretch of riverbank below London Bridge, barely 1,400 feet in total length, established by royal decree in 1558.
20 chests of spices from the east. Weigh them carefully.
Every bale of cloth, every chest of spice, every barrel of wine had to pass through these quays and through the hands of the customs officers who worked there.
A steep price, but here is your due.
The system had been designed to prevent smuggling and ensure the Crown received its taxes. In practice, it produced something closer to a permanent invitation to organised theft. The quays were overwhelmed. Ships waited for days, sometimes weeks, to unload. Goods sat exposed in lighters on the open river or piled on the quayside in all weathers. And in the darkness between moored ships, the river's more enterprising inhabitants went to work. They had names that the magistrates gave them in official reports: River Pirates, Light Horsemen, Heavy Horsemen, Mudlarks, Scuffle Hunters. The heavy horsemen were corrupt coopers and dock workers who concealed small quantities of goods on their persons each day, concealing brandy in specially sewn inner pockets, slipping pepper into hat linings, walking away through the evening crowds with enough stolen spice to sell at considerable profit. The Mudlarks were boys, and sometimes old men, who waded in the river's tidal mud at low water, retrieving whatever had been quietly dropped from a lighter above. The river pirates worked at night, under oars, cutting mooring lines and making off with entire lighters in the dark. It was, as one later observer documented, after cataloguing the whole system in furious detail, a single gigantic arrangement of plunder operating so openly and for so long that those who participated in it no longer considered it stealing. It was simply how the river worked. Across London Bridge, still the only dry crossing of the Thames in the city, still lined with its improbable towers of shops and houses, lay Southwark, and beyond that, the eastern parishes that grew directly from the demands of the port. Wapping, Ratcliff, Limehouse. These were not wealthy places. They were the bones of the operation, the neighbourhoods where the actual labour of the docks was housed and fed and repaired between voyages.
We'll be back afore noon.
Sailmakers worked in long, low sheds near the water. Rope walks, the narrow buildings in which hemp fibres were twisted into the miles of cordage a single large ship required, ran for hundreds of feet along the riverbank.
The quadrant and the compass cards, are they accounted for?
Chandlers sold every supply a departing vessel needed. Surgeons who specialized in the specific ailments of sailors, scurvy, tropical fever, the particular wounds of rigging accidents, kept their practices near the stairs.
Fill it again, Bess, before the fog lifts.
Taverns occupied every other building, and the people in those taverns were extraordinary.
We must hold this course, or we lose the tide.
Because the Port of London in the 17th century was not an English place. It was, by the nature of its function, a collision point for the entire world. Sailors from the Dutch Republic drank beside English privateers who had spent the winter raiding in the Caribbean.
To
And the Republic. We sail at...
Sailors from the West African coast, brought to England as servants or crew members, sat in Wapping alehouses and ate English food and struggled with the cold. Lascari sailors from India and the Persian Gulf had been appearing in London's dockside parishes since the early days of the East India Company, so consistently that by the middle of the century there was a recognized dockside community of South Asian sailors in Stepney, men who had come to England on East Indiamen and stayed, found work, found wives, found something worth remaining for.
We must finalize the marine insurance.
Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice had their own networks. Merchants from the Ottoman Empire traded at the Levant Company's offices near the river. The port did not merely receive goods from distant places.
Kept dry, remember that.
Make way, coming through with the pepper.
It received the people who had carried them, and London absorbed them all, uneasily, imperfectly, and permanently. Here is something that almost no one thinks about when they picture the 17th century Thames. The river was also the city's principal highway for its most powerful citizens. The nobility and senior clergy maintained private stairs at their riverside palaces, and their household barges, gilded, canopied, rowed by livened watermen in matching coats, moved through the same water as the rough lighters and the fishing smacks. The Lord Mayor's annual procession to Westminster had been a river spectacle since the 15th century. Samuel Pepys, who would begin his famous diary in 1660 and who worked at the Navy office near the Tower, commuted by wherry so routinely that when his personal waterman passed away during the Great Plague of 1665, he noted it as a practical inconvenience as much as a personal grief. The Thames was democratic only in the sense that everyone used it. It was nowhere near equal, but for a few minutes on the water, a Wapping apprentice and a Whitehall official were both at the mercy of the same tide, the same current, the same sudden squall blowing in off the estuary. Presiding over this entire carnival of commerce was the Customhouse, rebuilt in its new location on Lower Thames Street in 1559 and the nerve centre of Crown revenue. Every merchant who imported dutiable goods passed through it. Every cargo manifest was declared here, every customs duty negotiated and paid. The building was staffed by hundreds of officers, tide surveyors, tide waiters, landing officers, inspectors, whose official function was to assess the value of incoming goods and collect the Crown's percentage. Their unofficial function, known to everyone and policed by no one effectively, was to supplement their wages with carefully calibrated corruption. A tide waiter who went aboard a newly arrived ship to supervise its unloading could be persuaded, for a sufficiently generous consideration, to look the other way while a few bales disappeared. This was not exceptional behavior. It was the understood cost of doing business in the world's busiest port. What none of this paperwork and none of this theft could entirely diminish was the sheer physical wonder of what the port produced each day. Stand on the north bank of the Thames on a clear morning in, say, 1625, and look east. The river is covered. From the arches of the bridge to the curve of the bank at Blackwall, there is barely a gap between vessels. Tall masted ships from half a dozen nations, the smaller lighters and wherries weaving between them, the great oared barges of the livery companies moving in measured procession toward Whitehall. The smell is not pleasant. River mud, bilge water, the sharp bite of tar and hemp, and the residue of every cargo that has ever been unloaded on this bank. But it is unmistakably the smell of power. This is where England's wealth is arriving. Every bolt of cloth, every sack of pepper, every bottle of Bordeaux, every pound of tobacco from the new Virginia colonies across the Atlantic, all of it is here, coming off ships, being loaded into lighters, being carried to warehouses, being inspected by customs men and assessed and taxed, and ultimately dispersed into the markets and shops and kitchens of the largest city in northern Europe. The year 1601 brought the East India Company's first fleet. The year 1607 brought the first permanent English settlement in Virginia at Jamestown, opening a new Atlantic trade corridor that would, within decades, be flooding London with tobacco in quantities the Customhouse could barely process. The century would bring war, plague, fire and revolution, all of it passing through this river, all of it touching these wharves.
Welcome to the Thames.
The Great Plague of 1665 reached London partly through the port, carried upriver in the cargo and the crew of ships arriving from Rotterdam and Amsterdam, where the epidemic had already taken hold. The Great Fire of 1666 consumed the Customhouse and most of the riverside warehouses east of the bridge in the same catastrophic week that it devoured much of the medieval city, but they were rebuilt within years, sometimes months, because the trade could not wait. Commerce does not mourn. It adapts and continues. The river was England's aorta, and nothing, not plague or fire or civil war, could stop its pulse for long. Today, the Pool of London is quiet. The tall ships are gone. The lighters are gone. The watermen crying for fares at every set of stairs are gone. What remains is the river itself, still running on the same tides, still carrying the same cold North Sea salt. Canary Wharf, the gleaming financial tower built on what was once the West India docks, rises above the eastern bend of the Thames. The street called Cinnamon Street still exists in Wapping, its name a direct inheritance from the spice trade. Nutmeg Lane, Saffron Avenue, Clove Crescent, the docklands of East London are threaded through with the ghost names of cargoes that once made the city. And somewhere in the river mud below Blackwall, archaeologists still occasionally find fragments of 17th century East Indiamen. A copper fastening, a fragment of hull timber, the rim of a traded ceramic brought from the other side of the world and dropped in the loading. The river remembers everything. If you want to go deeper into the hidden history of cities, trade, and the world that built the modern age, subscribe to Mystique History. Every episode is built on exactly this kind of research, exactly this kind of recreation. The history that textbooks flatten into dates, we rebuild into sound and light and motion. Subscribe now and never miss it. I'm your host at Mystique History, and I want to know, what historical event should I recreate next? Let me know in the comments.